The last time my son laughed at my workshop, he was 28 years old and he held a rusted block plane in his hand like it was a museum relic that belonged to someone else. He said, "Dad, nobody uses this stuff anymore. You should let me clean this place out." I didn't argue. I just kept working the oil into the metal. He didn't know that Single Plane had bought half this house, and he definitely didn't know it was never mine to sell. My name is Elias, and I've spent 4 decades being underestimated by men in suits who saw nothing but sawdust on my collar. My son Marcus was one of them. He'd walk through that workshop door and see a tomb of obsolete junk. He never saw what I was protecting. That block plane wasn't just steel and iron. It was the smoking gun that proved the fabrication business he was set to inherit had been built on a lie, and the man he'd spent his whole life calling his late uncle. He wasn't just a forgotten footnote in the company's history. He was the architect of its entire value. The only question was how long I could keep that secret buried before the truth tore the family apart. I had been asking myself that same question for 23 years, ever since the night I sat beside Henry Marshall's hospital bed and watched him trace the faint initials on that block plane with a trembling thumb. He was 51 years old, his lungs filling with fluid from decades of breathing in metal dust, and he had exactly enough strength left to make me promise one thing. He called it his confession, not his gift. He said, "Elias, the patent was never in my name on purpose. If anyone ever comes looking for what I built, this tool is the only proof I ever existed inside that company. Keep it somewhere safe, and don't let them sell the truth away for a clean balance sheet." I was 38 years old, a floor supervisor who had married his sister, and I had no idea what he was talking about until the lawyer read his will 6 days later and skipped over the one thing that had made the entire business possible. The company everyone knew as Marshall Fabrication was founded in 1962 by my father-in-law, Arthur Marshall, a man with a gift for handshake deals and zero patience for the slow work of invention. Arthur opened the shop with a second-hand lathe, a welding torch, and a reputation for showing up on time. What he did not have was a product that anyone could not get from a dozen other shops in the county. That changed in 1971 when Henry walked into the back office with a wooden box under his arm and set it on the desk. Inside was a block plane unlike anything Arthur had ever seen, a design that integrated a micro-adjustable throat and a laminated blade that held an edge 3 times longer than standard tool steel. Arthur stared at it. Henry said he had been working on it in the evenings for 4 years. He had already filed a provisional patent in his own name a month earlier, but he told Arthur he was willing to license it to the family business for exactly $1 on one condition. The patent would stay in Henry's name, not the company, as an insurance policy against Arthur ever selling the business out from under the people who built it. Arthur agreed, and they shook hands. No written contract, just 2 brothers who trusted each other with the only thing that mattered. By 1980, Marshall Fabrication had grown from a 2-man shop into a 17-employee operation supplying specialty hand planes to high-end furniture makers across the Northeast. Henry kept working in the back, improving the design, adding variants for different wood species, while Arthur handled sales and expansion. The patent was renewed on time, every time, with the fees paid out of the company account, but the registration always remaining under Henry's name. Nobody outside the family knew. The official company records showed only a trade secret process, never the patent number itself. Arthur was savvy enough to understand that keeping Henry's name on the patent meant if anyone ever sued for infringement, they would have to fight a ghost, not the company's balance sheet. Then in 1994, Arthur died of a heart attack at a trade show in Chicago. Henry took over operations but refused the title of owner. He told me later he could not stand the idea of sitting in his brother's chair, so he stayed on as technical director and let the corporate entity float in a kind of legal limbo that nobody bothered to examine too closely. The company continued to operate under the Marshall name, paying the patent fees, but the estate was never fully settled. Arthur's will left everything to his wife Margaret, but Margaret had already been slipping into dementia and could not sign the documents to formally transfer the shares. Henry, out of love for his sister-in-law and a deep reluctance to involve lawyers, let it slide. He figured there was time. By the spring of 2001, Margaret was in a care facility and Henry was coughing up blood. That was when he called me to his workshop, which had become his refuge, and handed me the original block plane in its wooden box. the one with his initials, HM, stamped into the iron base next to the date he first sketched the design, March 14, 1971. Said the patent was due for renewal again in 2005, and if anything happened to him, I was the only person who knew the registration number, the only one who could keep it alive. He made me write the number on a slip of paper and tuck it inside the box. Then he told me about the second part of the agreement with Arthur, the part that had never been written down either. If the company was ever sold to an outsider, all licensing rights would revert to Henry's estate instantly. No grace period, no negotiation. That was the insurance policy, the poison pill Arthur had agreed to. The only problem was that when Henry died 3 months later, there was no formal estate to speak of. He had never married. He had no children that anyone knew of. The only evidence of his ownership was the original provisional patent filing, which was buried in a box in my workshop, along with the block plane and the slip of paper with the renewal code. I told myself I would sort it out when Marcus was old enough to understand. I told myself the business would coast along fine under the old Marshall name, that the patent renewal would keep getting paid quietly, and that nobody would ever dig deep enough to find the crack in the foundation. I was wrong about almost all of it. Marcus grew up inside the shop, but he did not grow up loving it. He came home from business school with a vocabulary I barely recognized: leverage, core competency, asset liquidation. He saw the fabrication plant as prime real estate with a roof that needed replacing and an outdated product line that could be manufactured cheaper overseas. The first time he mentioned selling the company was at my 60th birthday dinner 3 years ago. He said it with a smile between bites of chocolate cake, like he was doing me a favor. "Dad, we could move you into something smaller, something modern. You could actually enjoy retirement." I told him retirement was not a reward you gave yourself for walking away from the only thing you ever built. He heard it as sentimentality, so he let it drop, but I could see the math still running behind his eyes. His wife, Sabrina, saw the same math. She saw it in the square footage of the factory lot, in the rising property values of the industrial corridor that was suddenly popular with developers. She came from a family of real estate speculators who had made a fortune converting old warehouses into luxury condos. To her, Marshall Fabrication was not a business. It was a tear-down project with a stubborn old man sitting in the middle of it. She never said it that plainly, but she did not have to. I saw the way her gaze drifted across the ceiling beams when she visited. I heard the casual questions about zoning variances and historic designations. She was scouting, always scouting, and Marcus was too in love to notice. The pressure turned real 6 months ago when a development firm called Paragon Equity made an unsolicited offer to buy the company outright, including the land, for $1.7 million. Marcus brought the letter to my kitchen table and laid it down like a winning lottery ticket. He said Paragon wanted to roll up several smaller heritage tool brands and go national. He said the timing was perfect. He said Sabrina's father had already introduced him to a commercial real estate broker who could handle the whole transaction. He said, "Dad, this is the exit you never got." I looked at the letter and I felt the same cold quiet I used to feel when a machine slipped out of tolerance by a millimeter and nobody else could hear the change in pitch. I asked Marcus if Paragon's lawyers had done any IP due diligence yet. He said they were starting their review next week. I asked if he knew what they would find when they searched the patent registry. He said the patent was obviously a company asset filed under the Marshall name. I shook my head. I told him I needed to show him something. I went to the workshop, unlocked the drawer where I kept the wooden box, and reached for the block plane. The box was gone. I stood there with my hand in empty space, feeling the cold metal of the drawer bottom, and I could hear Marcus calling from the kitchen, asking what was taking so long. I did not answer. My eyes swept the shelf above, the cabinet to the left, the pile of old catalogs on the floor. Nothing. The box was not mislaid. It was missing. Somebody had been in that drawer, and I knew exactly who it had to be, but I did not yet know why. I turned back toward the kitchen, my heart beating in a way it hadn't since I watched a 2-ton press cylinder shear its bolts 15 years earlier. Marcus was still standing at the table, waiting, that Paragon offer letter still face up on the oilcloth. I walked past him without a word and checked the back door. The lock was intact. The windows were latched. Nobody had broken in. Whoever took that box had walked through my front door like they belonged there, because they did. Marcus asked what I was doing. I sat down across from him and studied his face, the face of my only child, looking for any flicker of knowledge or guilt. I said, "The block plane is missing, the original one Henry made, the one in the wooden box with his initials on it." He looked genuinely confused for about 2 seconds, and then something shifted behind his eyes. Not guilt, something worse. Recognition. He said, "The old plane with the rusted blade." "Dad, that thing has been sitting in that drawer for years. Sabrina asked me about it a couple months ago. She said it might be worth something as an antique. I told her it was just one of Uncle Henry's old projects." I felt the blood leave my face. I asked when exactly that conversation happened. He couldn't remember exactly. Sometime in March, he thought, after a Sunday dinner. Sabrina had wandered into the workshop while he and I were cleaning up the kitchen. He assumed she was just curious. I asked if she had ever mentioned the box again. He said no, but she had started asking more questions about Henry, about whether he had ever patented anything, about why the company name was Marshall and not something else. Marcus had told her he didn't really know the history, that it was all before his time. He said it like it was nothing, a casual curiosity from a daughter-in-law trying to understand her new family. I got up and walked to the phone on the wall. I have a small office in the back of the workshop with a filing cabinet that I've kept locked for 30 years. Inside that cabinet is a manila folder with photocopies of every patent renewal fee receipt, every correspondence Henry had with the patent office, and a letter from Arthur to Henry dated 1972, handwritten on company letterhead, acknowledging that the patent rights belonged to Henry personally and would remain so in perpetuity. It was the one piece of paper I had kept separate from the box, the only backup. I unlocked the cabinet, pulled the folder, and ran my finger down the index I'd written inside the cover. The letter from Arthur was still there. The renewal receipts were still there, but the original provisional patent filing certificate, the one with the registration number Henry had made me memorize, was gone, not photocopied, not missing, deliberately removed. I sat down in my desk chair and stared at the empty space in the folder. I had been so careful. I had shown the folder to exactly one person in the past year, my son. I had pulled it out last fall when he first started asking about the company's valuation, hoping to explain to him why the business wasn't just a piece of real estate, hoping to make him understand the weight of what Henry had built. He had looked through it politely, asked a few questions, handed it back. I didn't think to check if everything was still inside. I trusted him. Now I had to face the possibility that my son, whether wittingly or unwittingly, had given his wife the keys to dismantle the only thing that protected our family's legacy from a hostile takeover. I called Marcus back into the office and showed him the folder. I told him what was missing. I told him what Henry had told me in that hospital room, about the poison pill, about the reversion clause. I said, if that company is sold, the patent rights do not go with it. The buyers get a building and a brand name and a bunch of machinery, but they do not get the one product that accounts for more than 70% of the revenue. Without the patent license, Paragon isn't buying a business. They're buying an empty warehouse. And if they buy it anyway and try to manufacture that plane, they'll be infringing on an asset that belongs to Henry's estate. An estate that has no known executor except me, the man who's been renewing the registration in his name for 23 years. Marcus stared at me. He looked sick. He said, "Dad, if that's true, then Sabrina doesn't know. There's no way she knows. She just thinks the patent is a company asset like everything else." I pointed to the empty folder. Somebody removed the only piece of paper that contains the patent registration number. Without that number, I can't prove the patent still exists under Henry's name. And without that proof, the patent office will consider the registration abandoned the next time the renewal comes due, which, as of this morning, is in 4 days. He sank into the chair across from my desk. He put his head in his hands. I asked him to think very carefully. Had Sabrina ever mentioned the folder? Had she ever asked about Henry's patent? He was silent for a long time. Then he said quietly that about 2 weeks ago, Sabrina had come home from a meeting with her father's attorney and mentioned that Paragon's legal team had flagged something unusual in their preliminary review. Something about the patent database showing an inventor name that didn't match the company's incorporation records. They were trying to determine whether it was a filing error or something more complicated? Sabrina had asked Marcus if he knew anything about an H. Marshall who was Arthur. Marcus had told her it was probably just Arthur's brother Henry, who had worked in the shop back in the day, but he was long dead and it didn't matter. Sabrina had nodded and said she'd let the lawyers sort it out. I stood up. I told Marcus we didn't have 4 days to guess who took what. I told him we had to find that wooden box and the provisional certificate inside it, because they were the only things that tied Henry's name to the patent number that the patent office still had on file. Without them, Paragon's lawyers could argue that the patent had always been a clerical error, that Henry had been acting as an employee of the company when he filed it, and that the intellectual property belonged to Marshall Fabrication outright. And if they made that argument in court, with no original documentation to refute it, they would win. They would buy the company and the patent together, sell off the land, and my son would walk away with a check he didn't deserve for a business he never understood. Marcus said Sabrina wouldn't do this. Her father wouldn't do this. This is just a misunderstanding. I looked at him and saw the boy who used to follow me around the shop with a toy hammer, and I saw the man who had married a woman who saw dollar signs where I saw sawdust, and I realized that I had failed him in the one way that mattered most. I had protected the secret so carefully that I never gave him the tools to protect himself. I grabbed my coat and my keys. Marcus asked where I was going. I said I was going to pay a visit to the only person who had both the access and the motive to empty that drawer and that folder. Sabrina's father, Gerald Vance, the man who had spent 30 years turning family businesses into condo developments. The man who had personally introduced Marcus to the broker who brought the Paragon offer. The man who, I had just remembered, once spent 20 minutes alone in my workshop during a Christmas party 3 years ago, admiring my tool collection and asking very specific questions about which pieces had belonged to Henry. Marcus tried to stop me. He said I was jumping to conclusions. He said we should talk to Sabrina first, calmly, as a family. I told him that when a man waits 23 years to keep a promise and finds the evidence of that promise erased 2 days before the deadline, calm is a luxury he can't afford. I got in my truck and drove toward Gerald Vance's office with the folder on the passenger seat and the slip of paper Henry had given me, the one I had kept in my wallet for 2 decades, pressed flat beneath my driver's license. The slip with the renewal code, the only thing they hadn't found. Because here, what Gerald Vance didn't know, Henry had given me 2 numbers that night. The patent registration number, which went into the box and into the provisional certificate, and the renewal access code, a separate 4-digit PIN that the patent office issued every 5 years to authenticate electronic filings. I had written the registration number on the slip inside the box, but I had never written down the access code anywhere but in my own memory. I recited it to myself every night before I went to sleep, a habit Henry had taught me. He said the worst thing you can do with a secret is put it all in one place. So while Gerald's people might have the patent number now, they didn't have the code. And without the code, they couldn't file a single document that would hold up under scrutiny. I pulled into the parking lot of Vance Development Group and sat in the truck for a moment, looking at the glass and steel building, the manicured hedges, the logo that looked like a dollar sign folded into a handshake. I made one call to a patent attorney I'd known for 20 years, a man named Frank Delgado who had handled the renewal in 2015. I told him everything. He listened without interruption. Then he said, Elias, if Gerald Vance has the original certificate and the box, he might try to file a substitution of inventor with the patent office. He'd need the registration number to do it. If he succeeds before you file a correction, the patent flips from Henry's name to the company's name. And at that point, you've got nothing but a lawsuit that takes years and costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. I asked him how long a substitution filing took to process. Frank said if filed electronically with the correct number and a notarized statement from a company officer claiming clerical error, it could go through in as little as 24 hours. I looked at my watch. It was 3:15 on a Friday afternoon. The patent office closed at 5. Gerald had all the pieces he needed, except one. The notarized statement had to come from a company officer. And the only officer of Marshall Fabrication still listed on the state incorporation records, thanks to 30 years of paperwork neglect, was me. I hadn't thought about that in years. When Arthur died, his shares were supposed to transfer to Margaret. When Margaret was declared incapacitated, the shares were supposed to transfer to a trust that Henry was supposed to set up. Henry never did. He just kept filing the annual reports with the state, listing himself as president and me as secretary. When he died, I kept filing them out of habit, out of necessity, because nobody else was paying attention. I had never formally claimed ownership. I had never needed to, but legally, on paper, I was the only person with the authority to sign documents on behalf of the corporation. Gerald could have the patent number. He could have the notary and the filing fee, but he could not forge my signature on a corporate resolution without committing a felony. I got out of the truck and walked toward the glass doors, the late afternoon sun glinting off the building's surface, and I realized that the man I was about to confront had no idea that the quiet old machinist he'd been trying to outmaneuver was still the one person standing between him and a $1.7 million transaction. And I had exactly 48 hours to make sure he stayed there. The receptionist at Vance Development Group looked up from her screen and smiled the kind of smile that had been trained to handle angry old men in flannel shirts. I told her my name and said I was there to see Gerald Vance. She asked if I had an appointment. I said I did not, but I was reasonably certain he would want to see me anyway, since I was the man who currently owned the intellectual property rights to the only thing making his daughter's marriage look like a smart investment. She blinked. I waited. 40 seconds later, Gerald appeared at the end of the hallway, jacket off, sleeves rolled, his face arranged into pleasant surprise. He walked me back to his corner office, a room full of glass and leather and framed photos of strip malls he had turned into mixed-use developments. He offered me coffee. I declined. He sat behind his desk and clasped his hands. He said he'd been meaning to call me, actually, that he was glad I'd stopped by. He said there had been some developments in the Paragon Review that he thought I should know about. He said it like he was doing me a kindness. I set the manila folder on his desk and opened it to the empty spot where the provisional certificate used to be. I said, "Gerald, I'm going to ask you one time, where is the wooden box and the document that was inside it?" He didn't flinch. He just tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he's deciding which version of the truth to offer. Then he leaned back and said, "Elias, I think you may be confused about what belongs to the company and what belongs to a dead man's hobby." That was when I understood that he wasn't going to pretend he hadn't taken them. He was going to argue that he had the right to. He walked me through it calmly, as if he were explaining a zoning variance to a nervous city councillor. His legal team, he said, had been doing a routine property audit ahead of the Paragon sale. They had flagged the patent registry discrepancy, the H. Marshall inventor name, the unusual filing history. They had contacted the family to gather any relevant documentation. Sabrina had mentioned the wooden box in my workshop, the old block plane, the initials. Gerald said it had seemed prudent to retrieve those items before they were accidentally discarded or damaged. He said he had sent Sabrina to collect them with my son's full knowledge. I told him that was a lie. I asked him if he knew the legal definition of conversion, which was the civil version of theft, and I asked him if he understood that taking a document from a locked cabinet without the owner's consent was not an audit, it was a crime. Gerald's smile thinned by a millimeter. He said he was only trying to protect the interests of the family, including mine. He said the patent, once the substitution was filed, would be properly assigned to the company, which would simplify the sale and make everything clean for everyone. There it was. He had already filed the substitution. I kept my voice level. I asked him how he had managed that, given that the notarized corporate resolution required the signature of a company officer. He looked at me with something that bordered on pity. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and slid it across the desk toward me. It was a corporate resolution, dated 3 days earlier, authorizing the substitution of inventor and the reassignment of patent rights from the estate of Henry Marshall to Marshall Fabrication Incorporated. At the bottom, above the notary stamp, was a signature, my son's name, Marcus Elias Bowen. I stared at it. The signature looked right. The slope of the M, the tight curl of the B, but the date was March 18th. And on March 18th, Marcus had been in Cincinnati at a trade show, I remembered because he had called me that night from his hotel, complaining about the room service. I looked at the notary's name, Carolyn Dewitt. I didn't recognize it, but I recognized the address beside it. It was the same building where Gerald kept his personal legal counsel on retainer. I slid the paper back across the desk. I told Gerald that Marcus had been in Ohio on the date of that notarization, that I had phone records and hotel receipts to prove it, and that if Carolyn Dewitt had claimed to witness his signature in person, she had perjured herself. I told him that I was reasonably certain the State Bar Association would find that interesting. Gerald's expression didn't change, but the skin around his knuckles went white where his hands were folded on the desk. He said I was making a very serious accusation. I said I hadn't made one yet. I was simply pointing out a calendar discrepancy that any first-year law student could spot. Then I asked him again where the wooden box was. He stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the parking lot where my truck sat with its cracked windshield and its rusted wheel wells. He said, "Elias, you're a man who's been holding on to something you don't fully understand. That patent, that little block plane, it's not just a tool, it's a record. Do you know what a pristine example of Henry's original prototype would sell for at an industrial antiques auction? I've had it appraised. $75,000, maybe more. The tool alone, without the patent rights, is worth a small fortune. And you've been keeping it in a drawer in a workshop that doesn't even have a deadbolt." That number landed like a punch. $75,000 for a single-hand plane. I thought about the research I had done years ago, the auction records I had skimmed in the days after Henry died, trying to understand if the tool itself held value beyond the patent. I had seen numbers, but nothing like that. Henry had built something that was not only legally significant, but historically rare, and Gerald had already had it appraised. Which meant he had already shown the prototype to a dealer, probably months before he told Marcus a single word about the Paragon deal. I realized then that Gerald's plan was not simply to buy the company. It was to acquire the patent at a corporate discount, strip the intellectual property, and then sell the physical artifact separately to a private collector, pocketing the auction proceeds while the company's valuation collapsed. Marcus would get his buyout, but he would be selling a gutted shell, and the one object that would have proved the true value of what Henry built would disappear into a private collection somewhere in Switzerland or Japan, never to be seen again. Gerald wasn't just trying to outmaneuver me. He was liquidating a legacy piece by piece. I asked him where the box was now. He turned from the window and said it was in a secure location, pending the resolution of the substitution filing. He said that if I cooperated, he would ensure the artifact was returned to the family after the sale closed. He said it like he was offering me a favor. I told him I didn't need his cooperation. I told him the substitution filing was void the moment I proved the signature was fraudulent, and I was already reaching for my phone to call Frank Delgado. Gerald raised a hand. He said I should consider one more thing before I made any calls. He said that Henry's estate, as it turned out, had never been probated. Henry had died without a will, at least not one on record with the county, and no one had ever stepped forward to administer the estate. That meant, under state law, the patent technically belonged to Henry's heirs, but Henry had no children, no surviving spouse. His only living blood relative was his sister, who had predeceased him by 11 years. Her only heir was her son, my son, Marcus. Gerald said that meant Marcus, whether he knew it or not, was the rightful heir to Henry's patent, not me. I had been renewing the registration in Henry's name for 23 years as a friend and a brother-in-law, but I had no legal standing to assert ownership. I was, in the eyes of the law, a well-meaning interloper. I felt the room shift slightly, the way a floor tilts when a house settles onto a cracked foundation. I had never thought to check the probate files. I had assumed, because Henry had named me as the person to keep the patent alive, that I was the person with the authority to do so. But Henry had been a man who avoided paperwork the way other men avoided illness. He had never formalized his wishes. He had never written a will. He had just handed me a block plane and a slip of paper and trusted me to fill in the rest. And now that trust was being used against me by a man who had turned my own son's legal inheritance into a weapon. Gerald saw the change in my face. He sat back down and leaned forward, his voice softening into something that sounded like reason. He said he wasn't my enemy. He said he wanted what was best for Sabrina and Marcus, and that the cleanest path forward was for Marcus to sign a new resolution, properly notarized this time, assigning the patent to the company voluntarily. The sale would go through, everyone would get paid. I could retire in comfort. The block plane could be donated to a museum. No one needed to involve lawyers or press charges. He said he was giving me the chance to settle this quietly as a family. I looked at Gerald Vance for a long moment. I looked at the framed certificates on his wall. I looked at the photo of him shaking hands with a senator. I thought about the 23 years I had spent waking up every morning knowing that the only thing standing between Henry's work and the world's willingness to erase it was the memory of a 4-digit code I recited to myself in the dark. I thought about my son, who had signed something he didn't understand, whose wife had walked into my workshop and removed the one object that held the entire story together. I thought about Sabrina, who had never looked at me the way she looked at a balance sheet, who had probably been groomed by this man since childhood to see every relationship as a transaction. And I thought about Henry in that hospital bed, his fingers ghosting across the initials he had stamped into iron 40 years earlier, telling me the only thing that mattered was that the truth didn't disappear. I stood up. I told Gerald I would give him my answer by Monday morning. I told him I needed to speak to my son. He smiled, the smile of a man who believed he had already won, and he walked me to the lobby. He said he looked forward to resolving this amicably. I got in my truck and sat in the parking lot without starting the engine. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the asphalt. I reached into my wallet and pulled out Henry's slip of paper, the one with the access code, 4 digits, 6317, the number I had said to myself every night for almost a quarter of a century, and I realized that I had missed something obvious. The slip wasn't just a code, it was a reference. Henry had chosen those numbers for a reason. He had been a man who thought in patterns, who saw meaning in measurement, who had once told me that every tool he designed had a hidden calibration mark that only he could read. 6317, June 3rd, 1917. That was his father's birthday, the man who had taught Henry how to plane his first piece of wood. I suddenly knew with a certainty that felt like a hand on my shoulder that Henry had left more than a number. He had left a trail. And somewhere in my workshop, in a place Gerald Vance had never thought to look, there was a second box, one with a different set of initials, one that held the original will that Henry had told his attorney he would file and never did, one that, if I found it before Monday morning, would prove that I was not just the keeper of the patent, I was the executor. And the entire sale, the entire scheme, the entire chain of assumptions Gerald had built his fortune on was about to collapse under its own weight. I turned the key in the ignition, and I drove home faster than I had ever driven that old pickup before. The workshop lights flickered when I hit the switch, the old fluorescent tubes buzzing in that familiar, half-dead way they had buzzed for 10 years. I didn't stop to warm my hands or take off my coat. I walked straight to the back wall where Henry's old machinist chest sat buried under canvas tarp, the one piece of furniture I had never been able to bring myself to open since the week he died. The chest was oak, stained dark, with brass corner brackets and a faded leather handle that had gone stiff with age. Henry had told me once that his father had bought it at an estate sale in 1947, that the man who sold it had said there was a secret compartment, but he had never found it, and Henry had laughed and said he'd spent 40 years looking and never found it either. I had thought it was just a story. Now I wasn't so sure. I pulled the tarp off and knelt in front of the chest. The top tray was full of worn-out calipers, chipped grinding wheels, a few rusted files. I lifted the tray out and set it aside. The main compartment held nothing but a folded shop apron and a coffee can of loose screws. I ran my hand along the inside walls, feeling for gaps or false bottoms. Nothing. Then I thought about the number. 6317, June 3rd, 1917. I tipped the chest forward and looked at the bottom edge. The brass corner brackets were held on with slotted screws, every one of them oxidized but uniform, except one. One bracket had a screw that was different, not brass but blued steel, the kind of screw Henry had used in his plain designs. I found a jeweler's screwdriver in the top tray and backed it out carefully. The bracket came loose, and behind it, tucked into a hollow that had been chiseled into the oak itself, was a slim wooden case no bigger than a cigar box. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside was a folded document on heavy paper, yellowed at the edges, and under it, a photograph I had never seen before. The photograph showed Henry and Arthur Marshall standing in front of the original shop in 1962, both of them grinning, Arthur with his arm around Henry's shoulder. Henry was holding the block plane. On the back, in Henry's handwriting, were the words, "The day we agreed the truth would stay between us." I unfolded the document. It was a last will and testament, dated October 14, 2001, 3 months before Henry died. The witness signatures were there, clear and unambiguous. Frank Delgado, patent attorney, and a woman named Louise Carver, a notary public whose stamp was still faintly visible. The will was short, barely 2 pages. It appointed me, Elias James Bowen, as executor of his estate. It devised all of his intellectual property rights, including but not limited to U.S. Patent number 4,072,113, to me personally, in trust, with the explicit instruction that I should use the patent to protect the company from sale or dissolution until such time as my son Marcus reached the age of 40, at which point the rights would transfer to him directly, provided he had demonstrated a commitment to preserving the business as a working manufacturing concern and not merely as a real estate asset. Henry had known that Arthur's children were not interested in the shop, that the next generation might see the land and not the legacy. He had known that Margaret was slipping, that his own time was short. He had built a mechanism that spanned decades, and he had trusted me to hold it until the moment was right. And then he had hidden the will in the one place no one would ever look, inside his father's old machinist chest, behind a screw that only another toolmaker would recognize as out of place. I sat on the cold concrete floor of the workshop with the document in my hands, and I let the silence settle around me. After a while, I called Frank Delgado. He picked up on the 4th ring, his voice thick with sleep. I told him what I had found. He was quiet for maybe 10 seconds. Then he said, "Elias, do you understand what this means? You're the executor, you're the trustee. The patent office will accept the will as proof of chain of title. Gerald's substitution filing is dead the minute we file this with the county probate court." I asked him how fast we could do that. He said the probate court kept Saturday hours for emergency filings, and he could have a clerk meet us at 8 o'clock the next morning. He said he would also file an emergency notice with the patent office using the access code I had memorized all these years to freeze the substitution pending the court's determination. I gave him the code. He wrote it down. I asked him if there was anything Gerald could do to stop it. Frank said Gerald could try to challenge the will as a forgery, but with his own notary, the dates, and the witness testimony from Frank himself, that challenge would fail. He said the real question was what Marcus would do when he found out his signature had been forged on a corporate resolution. I told Frank I would handle Marcus. I hung up and sat at my workbench. I looked at the photograph of Arthur and Henry, 2 brothers who had trusted each other with a secret that outlasted both of them. Henry had been the inventor, the quiet one, the one who never wanted the spotlight. Arthur had been the salesman, the face of the business. Together, they had built something that worked, not because it was perfectly legal in every comma, but because they believed in the same thing. I realized I had been trying to do the same thing with Marcus, and I had waited too long to tell him the truth. That was my failure, but Henry had given me a second chance, and I wasn't going to waste it. Marcus came to the house late that night. I called him and told him I needed to see him alone. He showed up at the back door looking tired and wary, the way he used to look as a teenager when he knew he was about to be grounded. I sat him down at the kitchen table and I laid everything out. The empty folder, the forged signature on the resolution, the conversation with Gerald, the hidden will, the machinist's chest, the photograph. I told him everything, not in fragments the way I had told him before, but all at once, the whole chain of events from Henry's hospital room to Gerald's corner office. I told him that his wife had removed the wooden box from my workshop on her father's instructions. I told him that his father-in-law had filed a fraudulent corporate document using a forged version of his name. I told him that the $75,000 appraisal of the block plane was not about preserving history, it was about liquidating it. Marcus listened, he did not interrupt. When I finished, he sat very still, his hands flat on the table, His jaw set the way it had always set when he was working through something he didn't want to believe. He asked me if I was sure about the forgery. I showed him the resolution that Gerald had given me, pointed out the date and the notary's address, and I asked him to compare the signature to his own. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, quietly, "Dad, I didn't sign this." He said it the way a man says something he knows will change everything. I told him I knew he didn't. I said the question was who did. He was silent again. Then he said he needed to talk to Sabrina. He said he would go home and ask her directly, and whatever she told him, he would come back and tell me the truth. I told him I would wait. It was almost midnight when he returned. He walked in and sat down, and his eyes were red. He said Sabrina had confessed. She told him that her father had asked her to retrieve the box from the workshop months ago, telling her it was just a family heirloom that belonged in safer hands. She said she had taken it because she believed him. She said she had not known about the forgery. The signature, she claimed, had been done by Gerald's paralegal, who had been told it was just a routine filing. Marcus said he believed her about the forgery, but he was not sure he believed her about the rest. He said Sabrina had cried and apologized and begged him not to tell me. He said he told her he already had. He said he asked her one last question: what did she think would happen to the business after the sale? And she had answered, without hesitation, that her father had said the old factory would make a beautiful residential conversion. That was the answer that broke something in him, not the lie, but the clarity. The clarity that his wife and her father had looked at the place where Arthur and Henry had built their lives, the place where I had worked since before he was born, and seen nothing but square footage and view corridors. He told me he had left her at the house and driven around for an hour before coming here. He said he didn't know what to do next. I told him it was not my job to tell him what to do with his marriage. That was his decision, and I would support him either way. But I told him he had one decision that was not his alone, the decision about the business. I told him about Henry's will, about the patent trust, about the condition that the rights would transfer to him in 2 years, when he turned 40, only if he committed to keeping the company running. I told him I had spent 23 years protecting something that was never mine to keep, and that I was ready to hand it over to him when the time came. I asked him if he wanted it. He looked at me then, not at the table, not at the wall, but at me. He said, "Dad, I don't know how to run a fabrication shop." I said I knew. I said I would teach him the way Henry had taught me, one machine at a time, starting with the block plane he had laughed at 6 months ago. He smiled a little. He said he was sorry for laughing. I told him he didn't need to be sorry, he just needed to learn. The next morning, Frank Delgado met us at the probate court at 8 o'clock. The clerk processed the will and issued a temporary letter of administration naming me as executor. Frank sent the letter and the will's key provisions to the patent office by electronic filing, along with the access code, and requested an immediate freeze on the substitution. By 10 o'clock, the patent office had confirmed receipt and flagged the substitution as contested. By Monday morning, Gerald Vance received a certified letter informing him that the substitution filing had been rejected pending probate determination, and that any further attempt to alter the patent registration would be subject to legal action. Gerald called me that afternoon. His voice was different now, colder, stripped of the pleasant veneer. He said he had been advised by counsel to discontinue any negotiations involving the Paragon sale. He said the wooden box and the block plane would be returned to me by courier within 48 hours. He said he hoped I understood that everything he had done had been for the benefit of the family. I told him I understood. I understood perfectly. Then I hung up. The box arrived on Wednesday morning in an unmarked padded envelope. I opened it in the workshop with Marcus beside me. The block plane was inside, still in its original felt lining, the initials HM as sharp as the day Henry stamped them. I lifted it out and turned it over in my hands. The blade was still sharp. The adjustment mechanism still moved smoothly, oiled by Henry's hands decades ago. I handed it to Marcus. He held it differently this time, not like a museum relic, but like something he recognized. Then I saw it, a faint scratch on the inside of the wooden lid, the kind of mark you would miss unless you were looking closely in good light. I tilted the lid toward the window. The scratch was not random. It was handwriting, Henry's handwriting, shaky but deliberate. It read, "Elias, the real patent is inside, HM." I looked at Marcus. He looked at me. I turned the block plane over and examined the sole. There was a tiny set screw near the toe that I had never noticed before. I found a hex key in the top drawer of Henry's chest, fitted it into the screw and turned. The sole plate slid back, revealing a hollow channel milled into the body of the plane itself. Inside the channel was a rolled cylinder of paper, thin and brittle. I pulled it out and unrolled it on the workbench. It was a second patent. A separate filing, dated 1999, for a laminated blade alloy that Henry had developed in his last years of work. A formula that was worth more than the original plane design by a factor of 10. A formula that had never been commercialized, never been disclosed to the company, never been included in any of Gerald's appraisals. A formula that, according to the attached notes, would produce a cutting edge that lasted 18 times longer than standard tool steel and could be licensed to every major manufacturer in the world. Henry had hidden his greatest invention inside the tool that everyone had dismissed as a sentimental relic. He had known that someday someone would look past the rust and the old initials and see only a dusty antique, and he had trusted that I would be the one who looked deeper. I sat down on the stool beside the workbench and I laughed. Not the kind of laugh that comes from humor, but the kind that comes from release. The kind that comes when a weight you have carried for so long you no longer feel it suddenly lifts. Marcus asked me what it meant. I told him it meant that Henry had not just protected the business, he had made it unkillable. The original patent would revert to Marcus in 2 years, and the second patent, once filed and commercialized, would make the company worth more than any condo developer could ever pay. The business was never mine, I said. It was never Arthur's. It was never really even Henry's. It belonged to the people who were willing to build it, slowly and carefully, and protect it from the people who saw only dust. Marcus looked at the unrolled patent on the workbench and then at the block plane in his hands. He said he thought he finally understood what I had been trying to tell him for years. I asked him what that was. He said, "Some things are worth more than a check." I put my hand on the back of his head the way I used to do when he was small, and I told him that was the first lesson. The second lesson started tomorrow in front of the lathe. He nodded. He was ready. The morning after we found the second patent, I woke before dawn and walked out to the workshop. The lights buzzed to life, and for the first time in over 2 decades, the air didn't feel heavy with secrets. Henry's block plane sat on the bench, the sole plate still slid open, the rolled patent tucked back inside its hidden channel. I stood there looking at it, and I thought about all the people who had walked past that tool over the years, seeing only rust and obsolescence. Gerald Vance, with his spreadsheets and his appraisal contacts, had seen a $75,000 antique. Sabrina had seen her father's leverage. Marcus once had seen a joke. Nobody had seen what Henry had actually put there, not just a piece of family history, but a future. That's the thing about men like my brother-in-law. They don't build monuments to themselves. They build things that work, and they trust that someday someone will take the time to look closer. The tools, the patents, the will hidden in the chest, all of it was a message waiting to be found by someone who cared enough to look beyond the surface. And the tragedy, if there is one, is that most families never do. They clean out the garage, they sell the business, they call an appraiser who quotes a number, and the real treasure gets tossed in a dumpster or sold at a yard sale for $5. I almost let that happen. I almost died with the secret still in my hands because I was too proud to tell my own son what we were actually protecting. Pride is a poor substitute for transparency. I know that now. Over the next months, Marcus started coming to the shop every Saturday. He learned to sharpen the blades, to adjust the throat, to feel the grain of the wood the way his great uncle had. We filed the second patent together, formally and publicly, and we began licensing the alloy to 2 manufacturers who had heard whispers of the old Marshall quality. The first royalty check came in at just under $40,000. There will be more. Gerald Vance's condo conversion never happened. Paragon Equity withdrew their offer. Some fractures don't heal and some do, time tells. As for the business, it's still there, the blue collar on Clement Street, the roof still needing a patch, the sign still faded. But inside those walls, something shifted. My son now knows the weight of that plane. He understands that a legacy isn't a check you cash, it's a blueprint you protect, and then hand off when the next set of hands is ready. So maybe that's the question you should ask yourself after watching all this. What's sitting in your attic, your basement, your father's old toolbox that the world has dismissed as junk? What story is hiding under the rust? Because the most valuable things in any family are rarely the ones you can see. They're the ones someone built in a workshop late at night and then hid behind a screw that only a toolmaker would recognize. That's worth more than money. That's worth remembering. If this story meant something to you, please subscribe. There are more of them out there, more invisible legacies, more quiet men in dusty workshops, and we're going to keep telling their stories. Until next time.